I always find it fascinating to watch how the MCU adapts the origin stories for heroes and villains. Sometimes they knock it out of the park and update it in a way that's even better than what's on the page, and other times they drop the ball and you wonder just what the heck were they thinking. So which MCU origins were better than the comics, and which ones were worse? Well, that's what I'm going to discuss today. Did Iron Man have a better origin in the comics or the MCU? What about Spider-Man? Or either version of the Mandarin? There's a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Thanos had a much better origin in the MCU compared to the comics. We know that in print, Thanos is fascinated with nihilism and obsessed/in love with the physical embodiment of Mistress Death. Everything he does is to try to impress her. And as much as I like the idea of one dude destroying half the universe in order to get his crush to notice him, I like the MCU Thanos, who watched his planet destroy itself and vowed to bring a certain perfect balance so that what happened on Titan wouldn't happen anywhere else. In Thanos' first introduction in the MCU, you know, back when he looked a lot different, there was a hint that they would follow the comic origin. But then after the Russo brothers took over, it became clear that they were giving Thanos a new origin. Now you'll find Thanos was right graffiti on New York urinals, and you wouldn't have gotten that with his comic origin. Although there actually isn't a ton of differences between comic Iron Man's origins and his MCU counterpart, I do think the tweaks they ended up making in the MCU were necessary. Tony's big endgame arc deals with him getting to have a conversation with his father Howard Stark, and the franchise before that had dealt a lot with Tony's daddy issues. But in the comics, did you know he was actually adopted? He's not the biological son of Howard and Maria Stark, but rather the son of two S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, one of which was a Hydra double agent. I think including that detail would have hurt Tony's entire arc in the MCU. Plus, on top of that, in the comics, he didn't meet Rhodey until much later in life, after he became Iron Man. And having the two meet when Rhodey looked like Don Cheadle instead of Terrence Howard wouldn't have given them as strong of a bond for later films. If you would have asked me before No Way Home came out, I would have said that Spider-Man's MCU origin is much worse than his comic origin. It didn't really feel like a Spidey origin, and the character was more like mini Iron Man. We didn't even get to know his true origin because this was the third iteration of the character we've seen in live action, so that was skipped over. But then the ending of No Way Home reset everything, and you could argue that everything leading up to the end of that movie has been his origin story. It set Peter up to be the Spider-Man from the comics, and it did so in a way that didn't invalidate everything that came before. Putting Peter Parker as Tony Stark's mentee meant that Peter should have never struggled in his personal life when it came to finances or work, while that's always been a key component of the character. Pressing the reset button at the end of No Way Home creates the overall perfect origin story for the webhead. Both Steve Rogers' MCU and comic origin deal with a skinny, sickly kid who desperately wanted to be a soldier, but his path to becoming Captain America is where things started to diverge. The comics see that as soon as Steve became Captain America, he was weapons trained for a few months and immediately sent into combat to fight the Red Skull. In the movie version, after becoming all hunky and taller, he was basically sidelined and was asked to be the face of the army instead by selling war bonds without going into actual combat. It took the conscious choice by Steve to decide to disobey orders and go rescue his friends for his superiors to realize that he was a soldier that needed to be in the field. I think this is overall better because it shows how much Steve Rogers had to face in order to become Captain America. The comics were just like, hey, skinny kid, you want to become a superhero and fight bad guys? And that was it. Thor's MCU origin is much more cohesive than the comic and sets up his entire MCU arc perfectly. The film sees Thor start as an arrogant warrior who just can't wait to be king, but after Odin sees how cocky Thor is, he enchants Thor's hammer, forcing Thor to realize what it means to be a real hero, and his overall journey deals with him becoming worthy. The comics actually had Mjolnir created and enchanted when Thor was just like 8 years old, and he knew that he would have to one day prove he was worthy enough to wield the hammer. This set Thor up with a goal at a young age to chase, but the MCU handles it in a better way. So for Thor to have the ability to wield the hammer, then lose it, it helps him understand what it takes to be pure of heart much better than the comic version of events. Now, some bad origins. The whole not being allowed to say the word mutant thing was really tough when introducing Scarlet Witch and her brother, who, although their backstories have been tweaked, started off as mutants in the comics. The legal hurdles over not having certain rights to characters created an awkward situation where Wanda and her brother were described as miracles, which maybe they were hoping audience members would be chewing loud popcorn at this moment and possibly hear mutant instead. Anyways, while they did fix Wanda's origin in the MCU in WandaVision, that felt more like a retcon from a franchise who now was willing to embrace more mystical stuff as opposed to steering clear of it in the past. Overall, the MCU hindered Wanda's true potential for the longest time because of a less than stellar origin. Do we know anything about Clint Barton's past in the MCU? How did he become a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent? Where did he meet his secret agent wife? What's his deal? Well, you'd never really know that watching the MCU because all the background story went to his best friend Natasha. And that's sorta a shame because Hawkeye's comic origin is fascinating. I mean, he was in the circus and a criminal, for heaven's sake. Don't you want to know about MCU Clint's doing circus and crime and whatever? That's the story I want to see, but I doubt we ever will at this point. And having Clint start off as a criminal would have veered too close to Black Widow's backstory, but I like the idea of Clint helping Natasha because he knew what it was like to do bad things but not wanting to. Makes their whole relationship a little sweeter. When Doctor Strange was released, it was slightly criticized for being too similar to Iron Man. An arrogant genius undergoes a dramatic event that turns him into an arrogant genius superhero. And that's especially true because Doctor Strange's comic backstory is a lot richer than the one we got in the MCU. Like, did you know that Strange was always destined to become the Sorcerer Supreme? So much so that Baron Mordo sent demons to haunt Strange's dreams when he was 8 years old. That idea of a preordained origin story is missing from the MCU, and that's a bummer. Plus, in the movie, Strange just lost the use of his hands, which sent him into his depression, but in the comics, Stephen has a much more complicated relationship with loss, having lost his sister at a young age, then the passing of his mother during his residency made him more impersonal as a surgeon, and then his brother was hit by a car after yelling at Strange to go visit their father, who was also on his deathbed. Yeah, that sense of loss didn't translate as well to the MCU. Anyone who knows my voice on this channel knows that I'm unhappy with the way they treated the Hulk in the MCU. I think Hulk is one of the best Marvel characters with one of the most interesting backstories, and yet his true origin hasn't been tapped into yet. The Hulk origin we got came when Bruce still looked like Edward Norton and Thunderbolt Ross came to him for help in basically recreating the super soldier serum. Of course, things go wrong and we get the big green guy. Nothing else of substance has been discussed regarding Bruce's past, which is mostly because rights issues have made a Hulk solo film in the MCU extremely difficult. But comic readers know that Bruce's past is much more traumatic than what we've seen. A tough relationship with his father, to put it lightly, is such a defining element for Bruce's origin that the MCU hasn't bothered with. Maybe because we're still having crazed Nick Nolte flashbacks? In the comics, Hank Pym is the creator of Ultron, and that was a problem by the time Age of Ultron rolled around since Hank Pym wasn't around in the MCU yet. The solution was to make the birth of Ultron mostly an arrogant and paranoid Tony Stark story with some Bruce Banner thrown in there as well. I think this was a mistake. Yes, it made Ultron's origin more tied with Tony Stark and fit with the movie's themes and story, but it forever tainted Tony Stark just a little, and gave off the impression that he makes terrible decisions. And that's mostly because Ultron's origins were glossed over. He came online and immediately became a bad guy after 2 seconds on the internet, which feels a little rushed. Okay, halfway done. We've been through some good and some bad MCU origins, now let's mix and match. Falcon had a better origin in the MCU compared to the comics. I liked that the movies made him a soldier, joining the Air Force and being the test pilot for the Falcon suit. This feels like a modern update that fit with the Captain America Winter Soldier vibe. Then, after losing his partner to an RPG, he dedicated his life to helping veterans with PTSD before meeting Captain America. That's a better setup than the comics, which saw him lured to a Caribbean island only to find Red Skull and his cronies there, and then Captain America suggesting he dons a superhero suit. Look, there are some aspects of Mantis's backstory that I appreciate were altered, but overall, I'm not a fan of how they tweaked her character. Yes, she's funny in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, but most of the jokes are at her expense. Like, sure, maybe the first time Drax laughs at her appearance, it warrants a chuckle. When the movie doubles down to joke about how absolutely hideous and repulsive she is, it feels like a bit much. Anyway, the MCU also changed it, so she was raised by Ego her entire life and is socially awkward and almost inept like the other Guardians of the Galaxy. But her comic backstory is much cooler, with her being a part of a Kree group on Earth who thinks she'll become the eventual mother of the most important being in the universe. Oh, and she also learns a bunch of martial arts, which is pretty cool. I'll stick with the Guardians for a second. The way they simplified Drax the Destroyer's backstory might not work for some, but I respect it. In the comics, did you know that Drax was originally a human named Arthur Douglas, who was driving with his wife and daughter when a Thanos-piloted spaceship basically takes him out permanently? Then later, Thanos' father, Mentor, captures Arthur's spirit and puts it in a body specifically designed to fight and destroy Thanos. If the MCU had followed that story, then Drax would have had a bigger impact on hunting Thanos over the course of the movies. Like, now imagine that big endgame beginning fight where it was Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and Drax all fighting Thanos? Doesn't sound right, does it? Thor Ragnarok is one of my favorite MCU movies, but its villain is just middle of the road. Yes, I like the idea that Hela helped conquer the galaxy with Odin eons before Thor and Loki were born and then was locked away, but it felt a little out of left field. Plus, I think Hela's comic origins are a lot more fun and had more potential. You know that instead of being Odin's daughter in the comics, Hela is actually Loki's daughter? How would that have changed the whole dynamic of that third movie? Yes, it would have put more spotlight on Loki rather than Thor, but did we really need to see Thor fight another evil sibling? Plus, if Hela had remained Loki's daughter, how would that have affected the God of Mischief and his path toward the good side? Plus, Hela's backstory and abilities were neutered in the movie compared to her terrifying comic powers, I'm just saying. Black Panther's origins in the MCU were heartbreaking. Yes, he knew he would eventually become king along with being the Black Panther, but he had no idea it would happen so soon. When his father T'Chaka is caught in the crossfire of the explosion made by Baron Zemo, T'Challa is forced to step up and be king. But first he wants to hunt down Zemo for revenge. But when he finds Zemo, he knows he has to break the cycle and not take him out, choosing justice and forgiveness over revenge. It's a great origin story for the kingly figure we would see in Black Panther. Much better than the comics, which saw him have to win the throne from his uncle after spending time in America studying. Let's talk about the Mandarin, aka Trevor Slattery. This origin reveal in Iron Man 3 still stands as one of the most controversial changes in the MCU, with it being revealed that the supervillain known as the Mandarin, the leader of the Ten Rings and the guy who Tony invited to attack his house without mounting a proper defense, was actually just a figurehead, and his origins lie on the small screen. Turns out the Mandarin was actually just a washed-up, boozy actor named Trevor Slattery. Some people loved it, other people hated it. Either way, it was definitely a worse origin than the OG comic Mandarin character. But they eventually tried again. In what is now probably the best retcon in the MCU, it's been revealed that yes, there was a real Mandarin whose real name was Wenwu. His origin is that he's this legendary, practically ageless warrior who discovered the set of 10 rings and used them to establish himself as a powerful crime lord. And since they made him Shang-Chi's father, I can confidently say this is a much better origin story for Shang-Chi's father compared to his comic counterpart, who's a character problematically named Fu Manchu. I think it's cool that Wenwu's origin both improved on what came before in the MCU and updated a comic character who needed a shiny fresh coat of paint. Vision's origins in the MCU. What do we think? Good? Bad? I'm leaning toward bad compared to his comic origins. The movies had Vision created by Ultron using vibranium, but as soon as he's brought to life, he's a good guy. I mean, he kinda has to be. Age of Ultron is a long movie, and they needed time for Thor to splash around in the cave pool, so of course everything felt a bit rushed. Anyway, the comic version of Vision was actually first made by Ultron using the robotic body of the Human Torch from the 1940s, and the brain patterns of Wonder Man. Not saying the vibranium body isn't cool and all, but come on, how awesome would it be to know that Vision's original body was from Human Torch in his android days? That would be a fun connection that would have made bringing in the Fantastic Four even easier down the line. Did you know that in the comics, Hank Pym had a first wife who ended up having a fatal encounter with the Hungary secret police? It was only after that did Hank start developing the Pym particles, where he soon became Ant-Man and found his wasp in Janet Van Dyne. But their marriage definitely had a few rough patches. This is all an origin that was overall a bit heavy for the MCU and the Ant-Man movies in particular. They smartly made it so Hank Pym kept his edge and his arrogance, but didn't come with the dramatic weight his comic character had to suffer through. Some would argue that this is a watered-down Hank, but again, I think his character's origins and personality fit within the Ant-Man world, don't you think? And last but not least, we have Icarus, a character whose comic origins were better than the MCU's depiction of the character. I actually don't mind what they did with Icarus's character in the Eternals movie, but I overall still like his comic origin more. Like, his origin actually includes him being the Icarus of the legends who flew too close to the sun with his son, who ended up perishing. That whole history presents a much closer connection with humans than the MCU movie depicts, especially since it's trying to sell the idea that Icarus and Circe are this one true couple for thousands of years. Then there's, of course, the big twist with this character in the MCU, but that doesn't really apply to his origins, so I'll leave that alone.